Kat had always been the kind of woman who understood that power didn't just come from money or status, but from proximity, who you stood next to, who trusted you, and who underestimated you. And as she stood in the dim glow of her office overlooking the restless pulse of the city, she allowed herself a slow, calculating smile, because the pieces were finally starting to fall into place in a way that felt almost too perfect to be accidental. And at the center of it all was Eva, brilliant, guarded, and still just vulnerable enough to be drawn into something she wouldn't fully understand until it was far too late to step away. Chelsea, of course, was the ideal anchor for the plan, her reputation polished and her instincts sharp but softened by a genuine belief that collaboration could still mean something honest, something productive, something that didn't have layers of manipulation woven into it, and that was precisely why Kat needed her involved, because Chelsea's presence would legitimize the offer, make it feel like an opportunity instead of a trap, a partnership instead of a carefully orchestrated move in a much larger game that only Kat could see in its entirety. And so when Kat first floated the idea casually over drinks, nothing too formal, nothing that would raise suspicion, Chelsea had leaned in with curiosity rather than caution, asking the right questions but not yet seeing the deeper implications, and Kat had answered just enough to satisfy her without revealing the full picture, painting it as a chance to bring in fresh talent, to expand their reach, to build something dynamic and new. And Chelsea, ever the visionary when it came to growth, had nodded slowly, already beginning to imagine what Eva could bring to the table, how her perspective might challenge and elevate their current projects. And that was the hook, that was the moment Kat knew she had her, because Chelsea wasn't thinking about control or leverage, she was thinking about potential, and that made her predictable in the best possible way. Eva, on the other hand, would require a more delicate approach because she wasn't naive. She had learned the hard way that offers that seemed too convenient often came with hidden costs, and she had built walls not just to protect herself but to maintain a sense of autonomy that she refused to compromise for anyone, and Kat respected that even as she planned to use it, because convincing Eva wouldn't be about persuasion alone. It would be about creating a scenario where saying yes felt like her own idea, where the opportunity aligned so perfectly with her ambitions that rejecting it would seem almost irrational. And so Kat began laying the groundwork quietly, feeding information through the right channels, making sure Eva heard about the project not directly from her, but through whispers, through industry chatter, through people whose opinions she trusted just enough to take seriously. And by the time the official invitation came, it wouldn't feel like a surprise, it would feel like a natural next step, something inevitable rather than engineered. Meanwhile, Chelsea began to take a more active role, reaching out to Eva with genuine enthusiasm, sharing ideas, asking for her input even before anything was finalized. And that was another crucial element of Kat's design, because Chelsea's sincerity would disarm Eva in ways that no calculated pitch ever could, creating a sense of mutual respect and collaboration that would make the eventual offer feel less like a recruitment and more like an invitation into something meaningful, something that had already begun to take shape with her in mind. And as the conversations unfolded, Kat watched from just behind the scenes, stepping in only when necessary, guiding the narrative without dominating it, allowing the relationship between Chelsea and Eva to develop organically while subtly steering it toward the outcome she wanted. And there were moments, brief and fleeting, when even Kat felt the pull of what they were building, the possibility that this could be more than just a scheme, that it could actually become something real, something powerful in its own right. But she never let herself dwell on that for too long, because sentiment had no place in strategy, and she couldn't afford to lose sight of the reason she had started this in the first place. Eva, for her part, found herself increasingly drawn into the idea despite her better instincts, intrigued by the challenge, by the chance to work alongside someone like Chelsea whose reputation she had long respected, and even Kat, whose involvement she viewed with cautious curiosity, seemed to offer a level of ambition and drive that was difficult to ignore. And yet there was a tension beneath it all, a quiet voice in the back of her mind that warned her to look closer, to question why this opportunity was being presented to her now, why the timing felt so precise, so aligned with her current circumstances. And every time she tried to pinpoint the source of that unease, she found herself circling back to the same conclusion, that maybe, just maybe, she was overthinking it, that not everything had to be a hidden agenda, that sometimes opportunities really did come at the right moment. And that was exactly the internal conflict Kat had anticipated, the push and pull between caution and ambition that would ultimately tip in her favor, because she had designed the entire situation to exploit that very hesitation, to make the safer choice feel like the riskier one. And as the day of the formal meeting approached, The tension between all three women became almost palpable, though each of them carried it differently, Chelsea with excitement and a touch of nervous anticipation, Eva with guarded curiosity and a determination not to be easily swayed, and Kat with a calm, controlled confidence that masked the intricate web of intentions beneath her composed exterior. And when they finally sat down together, the air thick with possibility and unspoken questions, it was clear that whatever happened next would set the course for all of them in ways none of them could fully predict, even Kat, despite all her planning, because the one variable she could never completely control was how people would change once they were brought together, how alliances would shift, how truths would surface. And as she began to outline the vision, watching their reactions with a careful, practiced eye, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something unexpected, something almost like anticipation, not just for the success of her scheme, but for the chaos it might unleash, because deep down, beyond the strategy and the manipulation, Kat understood one undeniable truth. When you bring the right people into the same room under the right circumstances, you don't just create opportunity, you create consequences. And those consequences have a way of rewriting even the most carefully constructed plans. Kat didn't rush the moment after laying out the vision, because she understood that silence, when used correctly, could be more persuasive than any argument. And as Eva and Chelsea absorbed what had just been presented, the scope of the project, the implied influence, the subtle but unmistakable promise of something that could redefine all of their trajectories, Kat simply watched, fingers loosely interlaced on the table, her expression composed but her mind moving several steps ahead, anticipating reactions, mapping out contingencies, and noting every flicker of emotion that crossed Eva's face, because that was where the real decision was happening, not in the words being spoken but in the hesitation between them, in the way Eva leaned back slightly as if to create distance while still keeping her eyes fixed on the proposal, in the way Chelsea leaned forward instead, already half invested, her curiosity evolving into something closer to commitment. And when Chelsea finally broke the silence, her voice carried a tone of genuine excitement that Kat had counted on, emphasizing the collaborative nature of the project, the chance to build something that wasn't constrained by the limitations they had all encountered in their respective paths, framing it not as a risk but as a rare alignment of talent and timing. And Eva listened, really listened, not just to the words but to the intent behind them, searching for cracks, for inconsistencies, for anything that might confirm her suspicion that this was too good to be entirely clean. But Chelsea's sincerity was difficult to challenge, and that was the brilliance of Kat's design, because it created a dynamic where Eva would feel almost unreasonable for doubting something that appeared so grounded in authenticity. And yet Eva wasn't someone who ignored her instincts, she had survived too much by trusting them, and so she asked the questions that mattered, not the surface-level details but the underlying structure, what control would look like, how decisions would be made, what happened when disagreements arose, and Kat welcomed those questions with a calm that bordered on reassuring, answering each one with just enough transparency to build trust while still keeping certain aspects deliberately vague, because complete clarity would invite scrutiny, and scrutiny was something she preferred to manage on her own terms. And as the conversation deepened, a subtle shift began to occur, one that even Kat hadn't fully anticipated, because Eva's skepticism didn't push her away from the opportunity, it drew her further in, engaging her in a way that passive acceptance never could, turning the proposal into something she wanted to shape rather than simply accept or reject, and that, in its own way, made her more invested, more connected to the outcome. And Chelsea noticed it too, the way Eva's posture changed, the way her questions became less defensive and more strategic, and she felt a quiet sense of relief because it meant this could work, not just as an idea but as a partnership, something real that could withstand the inevitable challenges ahead. And for a brief moment the atmosphere in the room softened, the tension giving way to a cautious optimism that felt almost genuine, almost unguarded. And it was in that moment that Kat made her most subtle move yet, shifting the focus from the structure of the project to its potential impact, painting a picture of what they could achieve together, the kind of influence they could wield, the doors they could open not just for themselves but for others. And it was a narrative that appealed to both women in different ways, to Chelsea's sense of purpose and to Eva's desire for autonomy and recognition. And as Kat spoke, she allowed just a hint of her own ambition to surface, enough to make it clear that this wasn't just a calculated play but something she believed in, something she was willing to invest in fully, and that authenticity, carefully measured, intentionally revealed, was what finally tipped the balance, because Eva, despite all her caution, recognized something in it that resonated with her own drive, the need to create something that mattered, something that couldn't be taken away or diminished by anyone else's agenda. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady but there was an edge to it, a condition rather than a concession, making it clear that she would only move forward if certain boundaries were respected, if her role was defined in a way that preserved her independence. And Kat agreed without hesitation, because she had already planned for that, already built it into the framework in a way that gave Eva the illusion of control while still keeping the larger structure firmly within her own influence. And Chelsea, caught between admiration for Eva's assertiveness and excitement for what they were building, nodded in agreement, reinforcing the sense that this was a partnership of equals even if the reality was far more complex beneath the surface. And as the meeting drew to a close, the decision, while not formally stated, had already been made, hanging in the air with a quiet certainty that all three of them could feel. And as they stood, exchanging final words and measured smiles, there was an unspoken understanding that this was only the beginning, that whatever they had just set in motion would not unfold in a straight line, that there would be moments of alignment and moments of conflict, revelations that would test their trust and choices that would force them to confront not just each other but themselves. And Kat, as she watched Eva walk away with Chelsea, felt a familiar sense of control settle over her, the satisfaction of a plan executed with precision. But beneath that, something else lingered, something she couldn't quite define, because for all her careful calculations, she knew that bringing Eva into this dynamic introduced a variable she couldn't fully predict, a force that could just as easily strengthen her position as unravel it, and that uncertainty, rather than deterring her, only made the game more compelling because in the end, Kat had never been interested in safe victories. She thrived on complexity, on the kind of challenges that required not just strategy but adaptability. And as she turned back toward her office, already considering the next steps, the alliances to reinforce, the information to control, she allowed herself one final thought, a quiet acknowledgement that in inviting Eva into their world, she hadn't just created an opportunity, she had set the stage for a confrontation that would redefine all of them, in ways none of them were truly prepared for. What Kat hadn't anticipated, at least not fully, was how quickly the energy between Eva and Chelsea would begin to evolve once the formalities were out of the way, because in the days that followed that pivotal meeting, what started as cautious collaboration began to take on a rhythm of its own, something organic and increasingly difficult for Kat to choreograph from the sidelines, and she noticed it first in the way Chelsea started looping Eva into conversations earlier than expected, forwarding drafts, asking for input before Kat had even weighed in, a small shift on the surface but one that subtly altered the balance Kat had worked so carefully to construct. And while she maintained her composure, responding with measured approval and occasional guidance, internally she recalibrated, recognizing that control once shared had a way of redistributing itself in unpredictable patterns, especially when two strong-minded women began to find common ground that didn't rely on her mediation. And Eva, for her part, was beginning to settle into the space with a confidence that came not from blind trust but from active engagement, testing boundaries, offering ideas that challenged the initial framework, and more importantly, watching how those ideas were received, because for Eva this was never just about the opportunity. It was about understanding the power dynamics at play, mapping out where influence truly lay versus where it was merely implied, and Chelsea's responsiveness gave her a foothold, a sense that her voice could carry weight here, that she wasn't just being brought in as an accessory to someone else's vision but as a contributor whose perspective could genuinely shape the outcome, and that realization, subtle as it was, began to shift her posture from cautious participant to invested collaborator, which in turn made her more attuned to the nuances in Kat's behavior, the moments where her openness felt calculated, the instances where decisions seemed to arrive fully formed rather than collectively developed. And Eva didn't confront it directly, not yet, but she stored those observations, letting them accumulate into a quiet awareness that would eventually demand to be addressed. Meanwhile, Kat adjusted her strategy with the kind of precision that had always set her apart, stepping in at key moments to reassert her role without appearing overbearing, introducing new elements to the project that required her expertise, creating dependencies that subtly redirected the flow of decision-making back through her. And for a time it worked, restoring a semblance of the hierarchy she preferred, but it also introduced friction, small inconsistencies that didn't go unnoticed by either Chelsea or Eva, because while Chelsea trusted Kat, she wasn't blind, and she began to feel the tension between the collaborative ideal she believed in and the controlled reality that was starting to surface, and that tension manifested in the questions she asked. The way she began to push for more transparency in meetings, encouraging open discussion rather than streamlined conclusions, and Kat responded with patience, even warmth, framing it as a natural part of refining the process. But beneath that response was a growing awareness that the dynamic was shifting in ways that couldn't be entirely contained, and Eva, watching all of this unfold, started to see the shape of the truth more clearly, not as a single revelation but as a pattern, a series of choices and reactions that pointed to a deeper intention behind her invitation into this world. And the realization didn't anger her as much as it sharpened her focus, because if this was a game, and it clearly was whether anyone chose to admit it or not, then she had no intention of being a passive piece on the board, and so she began to play her own moves, subtle at first, aligning herself more closely with Chelsea on certain decisions, offering insights that positioned her as indispensable, while at the same time maintaining just enough distance to avoid being fully absorbed into either side of the emerging divide. And this dual positioning allowed her to gather information, to see how each of them operated under pressure, how they responded when their assumptions were challenged, and it didn't take long for the first real conflict to surface, sparked by a decision that on paper seemed minor but in reality touched on the core issue of control. Who had the final say when consensus couldn't be reached? And the discussion that followed was measured but charged, each woman articulating her perspective with clarity and restraint. Yet beneath the surface there was a current of something more volatile, something that had been building since the moment Kat first set her plan in motion, and as the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the lines were no longer as neatly drawn as Kat had intended, that Chelsea wasn't simply an ally to be guided, and Eva wasn't simply a variable to be managed. They were both asserting themselves in ways that demanded to be acknowledged, and for the first time, Kat found herself in a position where maintaining control required not just strategy but compromise, a concept she had always approached with caution, because compromise meant relinquishing a degree of certainty, and certainty had always been her strongest advantage. And yet, as she looked at the two women across from her, Chelsea steady and principled, Eva sharp and unyielding, she recognized that forcing the issue would only accelerate the unraveling she had worked so hard to avoid, and so she made a choice, one that even surprised her in its sincerity, to yield just enough to preserve the larger structure, to allow the decision to be shaped collectively rather than dictated, and the effect was immediate, diffusing the tension without eliminating it, creating a new equilibrium that felt less controlled but more sustainable, at least for the moment. And as they moved forward from that point, the dynamic between them took on a new complexity, no longer defined by a single guiding force but by a constantly shifting balance of influence, trust, and ambition. And while the project itself continued to evolve, growing in scope and significance, it was the relationships between them that became the true focal point, the underlying narrative that would ultimately determine not just the success of what they were building but the cost of getting there. Because each of them, in their own way, was now invested not just in the outcome but in proving something, Kat, that she could still orchestrate events even in the face of resistance.